Hello, everybody. Welcome to this new episode of CCIR's Student Spotlight. With me today is Daniel Ha. Daniel is a rising junior at the King's Academy in Sunnyvale, California. Daniel, during his time at CCIR, was a part of the one-on-one research mentorship, where he had the privilege of working with Professor Harold Wydra from the University of Cambridge on a project centered around foreign policy and IR, in particular with regards to the liberal international order. So just to begin, Daniel, I want to say welcome to our podcast.
Yes, it's a very nice pleasure to meet you, Oliver.
Okay, so Daniel, if you don't mind, why don't we begin at the very beginning and talk a little bit about what initially brought you to CCIR, and in particular, what brought you to this space of foreign policy and IR?
Yeah, so over the past few months, I've sort of been exploring what different kinds of interests I have, what kind of passions I'm after, and international relations really, it really struck out to me that it was such a globally encompassing topic analysis and study. And I love watching the news, and I continuously update myself with CNN and other sources such as AP News as well. And on this, there's all sorts of global dynamics going on, things like diplomacy, where you have like deterrence as well. And recently, there's even been escalations in nuclear conflict and threats as well, particularly from the region of North Korea and Russia and China. So all this sort of just kind of came to me as, well, I wonder if there's like a program that I can do where I can pursue a project that really encompasses all my interests into one. And CCIR, when I heard about it, I was like, well, this is the perfect program for me because I can work with a mentor and they can provide me with a path on a suitable project that I can do, which really was very appealing to me at the very beginning. And that took me on my journey to begin the application process.
Cool. So tell me a little bit about your sort of first few meetings with Harold, where you guys were, let's say, sort of exploring the space a little bit more. Tell me about this process of coming to CCIR with a general interest in foreign policy and IR, and gradually sort of developing a more concrete project out of that with Dr. Wydra.
Yeah, so before I came to CCIR, I had some background in conflict between South Korea and North Korea, things about the Korean War, and even conflicts on World War I and World War II. They were all very useful backgrounds in my studies with Professor Wydra because he initially started by discussing during the first few meetings about how this process would go during the 14 weeks, how during the first 7 weeks, we would read over various literature reviews, supplemental materials, and even just study history as a whole on various subjects, particularly pertinent towards the end of World War II, all the way to current day as well. And during this whole entire process, I sort of was able to narrow down my focus from just international relations as a whole to more oriented towards the European side. Because last year I had done research on North Korea, as I stated previously, which meant that I wanted to explore something completely different, but related to the current issues in society today. And I was like, well, if I explore Europe, this is the perfect option. And it really coincided well with my mentor's expertise as well, because as a native European, he was able to provide me as an expert on all sorts of topic matters that were fundamental towards the development of this particular project.
Excellent. So I think this is a good point at which we can start talking a little bit about your actual project. So maybe give us a quick, give us the title and give us sort of the outline description of what your project was about.
So my title is Navigating the Post-Cold War Disorder, Examining NATO Enlargement and Nuclear Proliferation. So the outline of this project really focused on these two global consequences that happened after the end of the Cold War. And as we all know, the USSR disbanded, and afterwards it caused a great shaking. And that's why I named it the New World, the post-Cold War disorder, because it really was a disorder after all these post-Soviet states just splintered up, including Ukraine as well. And then this led to NATO becoming enlarged. But then during that process of enlargement, my paper was able to examine different opinions, such as the US's opinion, such as Britain's opinion, and also Russia's opinion on NATO's enlargement. And then there was a second smaller consequence tied to this whole global sphere of events, which was nuclear proliferation. And my paper focused on different examples, such as the NPG, the Nuclear Planning Group, and even the NPT, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. And on these various events, it was all sort of able to meld together to produce a very coherent analysis of what really happened after the Cold War ended. And after all that occurred, I was able to come to the conclusion that, well, there was clearly an enlargement with NATO, which was founded on April 4th, 1949. And there was even a consequence tied to that, which was how the UN had to intervene in various places, such as Yugoslavia. And my paper examines different multifaceted issues on things like NATO's intervention in Libya as well. So it shows really how NATO was able to evolve sort of as an organization. And the fundamental thing to recognize here is that after the Cold War, NATO really wasn't actually supposed to remain in commission. Many foreign policy experts thought that NATO would die away because it really just had served its purpose. But NATO was able to find new meaning in its purpose and its strategy and mission. And my paper really explores those parallels between even NATO and the United Nations and how they work together in different conflicts as well, and also how NATO was perceived from outside of the US. So my paper gives different analyses of how experts from all parts of the world perceived this new enlargement as well.
So tell me about the shift in meaning. Say a little bit more about what shifts in meaning NATO had, especially in this this great little phrase you have in the New World Disorder of the post-Cold War context. So what was the new meaning of NATO?
The new meaning of NATO was more as, well, it was sort of as a global, like more or less than a police force, but it was encompassing everybody's opinion at that point in time, because the original purpose of NATO was just to protect its Western allies. And after it had done that, it meant that it would deter aggression from the Soviet Union, it would stop communism, and we would really have policies of containment as well. And NATO really was just to promote democracy at that time and to just promote Western interests. But after the Cold War, people realized that the USSR had broken up. You had states such as Kosovo and Serbia and the Baltics and the Balkans, and they were very unstable places. So what NATO realized is that if all we're going to do once again is to try to stop communism and authoritarian regimes, then it's clearly not going to work out. So we need to adapt to the new circumstances. And really how NATO did that is they started taking into context how we can incorporate the Eastern European sphere into the Western world. And by doing so, create a greater liberal international order. Now, the liberal international order is actually starting to fail currently, but NATO began to redefine its purpose after the Cold War. And by doing so, it was able to open itself up more globally and also to deter tensions as well. Part of its reason why it decided to open up is because when NATO was trying to establish the nuclear non-proliferation treaty with Russia, actually at the time, Russia was very much against NATO's allies having nuclear weapons in their territory, unless it was strictly under NATO's control. So NATO had to make compromises. And so they decided to develop the Nuclear Planning Group, which was designed to provide deterrence, but at the same time not annoy its enemies at that current point in time, or adversaries. And so NATO really had to find this fine balance between maintaining its good relationship with its allies and at the same time not angering or becoming an aggressor to anyone, as NATO, even after the Cold War, reaffirmed its primarily defensive purpose. It still remains as a defensive organization today, and it really is a North Atlantic Treaty Alliance and an organization concerned around trying to prevent all sorts of conflict from breaking out. But NATO decided to become more open towards different ideas after the Cold War.
So one thing I'm curious about in your mentorship process in particular is, as you worked with Dr. Wydra, who really is an expert on a lot of these issues, what were some of the, let's say, the insights that you gained from Dr. Wydra that really shifted your perspective on any of these range of issues, from sort of the Cold War to NATO and the international order?
Yeah, so for the first 7 weeks of the program, Professor Wydra provided me on various texts, and we began by actually examining the history of what happened after World War II. The approach that he really inspired us to take was that we would look at these issues not just as separate conundrums that happened all over the place, but we would really look at it as a global web of activity that caused all these different concerns to arise and for NATO to enlarge. And really, the insights that he taught me were just all over this European sphere, because I didn't have this knowledge before, and it was incredibly useful. He shaped the program so that in the first 7 weeks, I would be able to have the knowledge necessary to quickly narrow down my focus into the paper that I wanted to write about. And it was incredibly beneficial to learn about even Bill Clinton's policies, as well as George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush's policies, because they all played a role in shaping how my paper was made, because my paper doesn't just discuss what happened in terms of NATO's enlargement and nuclear proliferation. But in the literature review section, it actually talks about how NATO acted during the Cold War and how their focus started to slowly shift. And the readings that Professor Wydra had provided for me earlier actually proved supplemental in developing my paper's major focus. And I even use some of them as additional references.
Awesome. And in terms of the, let's say, more big picture methodology stuff that, because I imagine, though you've probably been quite well read in history and international relations, as a high school student, you've probably never had the opportunity to have this level of systematic formal training in the discipline. So tell me a little bit more about sort of how this experience has shaped your understanding of, let's say, the way to think about political events.
Yeah, so previously in terms of political events, all I really saw was just the pain and suffering and torture that were being inflicted on the people who were being harmed, such as civilians. We can take the war in Ukraine, for example. We can also take North Korea's example of nuclear tests, where South Korean citizens are becoming increasingly concerned and worried that North Korea will indeed attack their country one day. And all these events I really now see in a much more intricate web. And when I see the war in Ukraine, whereas people my age may just see it as, oh, well, Russia decided to attack because Putin's a dictator, and because of that, he is a monster, and he resulted in all these casualties and sufferings, and it's just absolutely horrid. While that may be true, I see it more as a way to link up all the past events that happened, such as connecting the 2014 annexation of Crimea. We can even connect back the war in Ukraine and Russian history all the way back to the 1917, when you had the Bloody Sunday and they were trying to rise up against the Tsar. So really, history isn't just a bunch of events that just happened, and history is being made as we speak right now as well, and all these new political developments. And during that process, really, it's important not just to look at what is happening in terms of the effects on different populations, demographics, and even the international community, but really look at, well, what were the causes for that event to happen in the first place, and really examine that at a much deeper level. And by doing so, you can gain a better understanding of how these new developments were able to happen just out of the blue. Because really, if you look at it in terms of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it's completely irrational, because he didn't even announce it before he did. And after he did, he stated that Ukraine would be, one day they could acquire nuclear weapons on their current soil, and that was an immediate threat to Russia, even though it didn't even happen. And he also gave the justification about how there were Russian and Russo dissented people in Ukraine, and therefore he had to protect them because Ukraine was not treating them well. And these justifications, they don't really add up. But if you do trace back all of Vladimir Putin's history and what he did and how he was able to gain political support and how he's an ex-KGB member, and also even recent events such as the Wagner group dissenting against Putin, it all really goes to show how history is really tied together. And I never really imagined that until after I've finished this program. And it really opened my eyes to how I would perceive the new events that are happening in today's current context.
That's a really comprehensive answer. I want to now pivot a little bit and hear about some of the challenges and difficulties that you encountered in the process of articulating this research project.
Yeah, so definitely there were some challenges. Given that I had spent 7 weeks developing, thinking, and even towards the 8th week, we were just starting to get into the paper, and I had to manage all time commitments and make sure to get different parts of the paper done so that I could show to my mentor and he could read over it and provide me all sorts of additional, very, very useful feedback. But one of the challenges there was that we didn't really know until I was in the middle of the paper really what I wanted to go after. Like, we had all these different sections, and it was, to be quite honest, it was very disarrayed at that point in time. Like, there was information about how NATO had intervened in Yugoslavia, and also there was the bloody breakup as well, and also their intervention in Libya. But all these events were really just all over the place, and the paper didn't really have a format to it. I mean, I had a results section, I had a methods section, I definitely had an introduction, but it just didn't feel very coherent. And so my mentor really helped me to shape the paper into a much more sophisticated, but yet at the same time, it has all the content that I intended to have originally. When I first started off on this journey and we were beginning to think of different ideas for my project, we came up with 3 possible ideas, and we decided to choose the one involving NATO. But even after that, until I was towards the middle of the paper, I couldn't really decide on what were the 2 biggest consequences of the Cold War. And I wanted consequences that were much more global, broader, and more applicable to even the international sphere. So when I thought of NATO, I was like, okay, so what can we possibly get off of that? And so I had to go through lots of literature reviews and readings, not to mention selecting different sources. And it was all a very rigorous process, obviously. But one of the key takeaways that I learned is not just the fact that I was able to develop a paper, but CCIR's program was very well organized, that I was able to learn how to research in the social science area very well. And by doing so, it will really help me in my future prospects and also my future studies as well. And CCIR had such a great academic team that helped me through those challenges. And when I asked them to read over my paper, their responses were very prompt, clear, considerate, very benevolent. And it was just an overall very amazing process with an awesome mentor as well.
That's fantastic to hear. So I feel like as we are gradually sort of wrapping up this, so actually, before we get to my final question, I want to turn back a little bit and ask a bit more about your personal experience working with Dr. Wydra. I know Harold very well. He's an incredibly nice person. So I want to hear a little bit about your experience working with him.
Yes, Dr. Wydra was an expert in his field, not to mention that he was also an expert in other areas as well, including American history. And he had a very multifaceted approach that really helped me pursue and learn about the history that I want to learn about, because I am an avid history learner. But Dr. Wydra really guided me along this project very well. And I appreciate the fact that he had this sort of pre-plan before we started, that we would first spend the first part of this program researching and coming up with various ideas and coming up with all these different historical approaches as well, and even looking at philosophical debates between experts such as John G. Mersheimer and other people such as Leopold Nudi as well. And all these events really point to the fact that Dr. Wydra had a very systematic view of this program, and he helped me also enlarge my historical knowledge greatly because I learned more from him than I would ever in any kind of school context, or even on my own. I probably wouldn't have been able to take away that much knowledge. And I really am very grateful to him for all the knowledge that he's given me on both the Cold War, what happened before the Cold War, and what happened after the Cold War. And Dr. Wydra always came in with a very positive and happy attitude. And this really helped my experience be very, very nice.
That's fantastic to hear. So as we then approach the end of this interview, I want to ask you a question that I ask every CCIR student, and that is, research is a very difficult and sometimes daunting thing, especially for a high school student who maybe has never embarked on a concrete research project before. I want to hear a little bit from you in terms of what you might say to a student who's currently considering doing research for the first time in their life, but is a little bit daunted, a little bit scared by the prospects of doing something so intensive and so challenging.
Yeah, I definitely agree that research is a very challenging and very arduous process, especially if you're needing to look for sources and you're having trouble coming up with ideas. You can even get stuck on writer's block, even if you're just trying to do research in general. But what I would say to an incoming or prospect student is that if you're really passionate about doing research and you want to go after different topic analyses and you want to pursue even a career where you're being a researcher, or you just have an interest in any kind of research, whether it be humanities, STEM-oriented, computer science-based, even mathematical approaches, medical approaches, all those different fields, the one thing that research has in common is that it will really gift you with an experience that you won't forget. It teaches you how to come up and write a sophisticated paper with succinct wording and have a very good organization. And not only does it do that, but it really encourages your critical thinking, because when you have to do research, you really need to look at the deeper implications, because the real meaning of research is not to just brush the surface and just pick up whatever you can and then just leave the rest off at the sideline. No, and when you're doing research, you really need to look at whatever it was you want to examine, whether if it's the consequences, whether you're looking at CRISPR for a new medical approach, or if you're looking at big data for computer science. What all those three examples have in common is that you really gain a different kind of knowledge after you do it, because even though research is a quite challenging process, and I acknowledge that, it really helps you build your knowledge base and it develops your critical thinking. And so I would definitely say that if you're passionate about it and you want to try it, but you think it's a little bit difficult, I'd still say you should definitely go for it. And it was an incredibly fruitful experience for me. So, yes.
That's a really fantastic answer. So with that, Daniel, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. It was fantastic learning about your research as well as your experience at CCIR. I wish you all the best luck in your further intellectual pursuits and academic studies. And I just want to say thank you once more.
Thank you, Oliver.